Once upon a time, in an ancient kingdom, lived a king who was greatly feared by his people. He rained terror on his subjects for years, and everyone began to pray to the gods to save them from the hands of their wicked king. One day, the king, escorted by his guards, barged into a large expanse of land which belonged to a poor widow whose husband died many years ago. When the king arrived the land, he met the widow who was cultivating her crops. He ordered that the widow be thrown out of the land and all her crops destroyed, as he had need of the land. The poor widow pleaded with the king to spare her land, as the land was her only means of survival and the place where her late husband's body was buried. The wicked king ignored the poor woman's plight and ordered his guards to erect a great monument on the land. The king also instructed that no one should ever be seen on the land except himself, and that anyone he caught on the land would face his wrath. The poor woman wept bitterly as the king's guards threw her out of her late husband's land. She returned home and met her grandson Buchi, who was so furious on hearing what the king had done. When his grandmother went into her room, Buchi rushed to his grandfather's land and met the king's guards, destroying all the crops that his grandmother had planted. He tried to stop the guards from destroying the land, and one of the guards, following the king's instructions, beat Buchi up mercilessly, blinding one of his eyes. Buchi screamed in pain as he felt a burning sensation in his eyes. He tried to open up his eyes, but the more he tried, the more painful it became. By the time Buchi's grandmother noticed that he was away, she rushed to the farm, as that was the only place she knew that Buchi would go to at that time. On her way to the farm, she heard Buchi screaming in pain. She rushed as fast as her old legs could carry her, and when she got to where her grandson was, she noticed that one of his eyes could not open. Buchi was in so much pain, so his grandmother took him to the village healer's hut. After a few days, the village healer revealed that Buchi would no longer be able to see with one of his eyes. His grandmother was so heartbroken as the king came into her life to destroy all that mattered to her. She let out a loud scream and cursed the king, saying that his destiny would be exchanged for another. Buchi's blindness left a deep scar on his grandmother's heart. She nursed his wounds as best as she could and adjusted to the new life she was subjected to by the wicked king. The king continued to rain terror upon his people, and the people's prayers to the gods for deliverance grew louder by the day. The gods then decided to intervene and granted the poor widow her wish one night. The king was asleep in his palace when he had a strange dream where he saw his favorite drum in the palace being exchanged for one that seemed similar. He screamed at the person who exchanged the drums, commanding him to return his drum, but the person ignored him and continued to walk. The king woke up confused. He could not understand what his dream meant. He looked around but couldn't recognize where he was. "Where am I?" he screamed aloud as he ran out of the strange-looking room. The king met his servants and guards and ordered them to bring his favorite robe to him, and everyone looked at him in shock and began to laugh. The king was confused as he did not understand why his servants and guards were laughing at him, so he rushed to look into a mirror and noticed that he was in the body of one of his servants. How did this happen? The king screamed in frustration. I am the king, he screamed out loud, as all the servants and maidens looked at him in confusion. The king then ran into his throne room and saw someone who looked exactly like him sitting on his throne. Who are you and what are you doing on my throne? The king screamed out at the man who had taken over his real body. As he was screaming, the palace guards lifted him up and took him out of the throne room. The king had never been this helpless in his life. His destiny had been changed with that of his servant, and the king was confused and wondered how this was possible. For weeks, the king served his own servant in his own palace. He would come face to face with himself, sitting on the throne, and wondered how he could return back into his own body. The king, having lived in the body of his servant for some days, began to understand what it meant to be looked down on by those in authority. Even his personal chief guard was so unkind to him and didn't spare any opportunity to belittle and maltreat him. One day, all the maidens and guards were summoned in the guard room and accused of stealing an item from the king's chamber. They were all stripped and searched, but the item was still not found. So, the chief guard punished all the maidens and guard and starved them of food that day. The next morning, news began to circulate that the missing item was found in the possession of a palace maiden named Nneka. Nneka was tortured and asked to confess, but the more they tortured her, the more she stood her grounds that she did not steal the item from the king's chamber. The king, living in his servant's body, saw this and had pity on Nneka. He then decided to do something about it. He knew that he had no authority in the body of his servant, so he decided to discreetly investigate what really happened. The king spoke to several palace guards and maidens about Nneka and the possibility of her stealing the item from the king's chamber, and all the maidens and guards said that they believed Nneka was innocent. After talking to several guards and maidens, the king found out that the chief guard who accused Nneka of stealing had made several advances at Nneka, who rejected him publicly. They believed that the chief guard felt humiliated and did this to get back at Nneka for rejecting his advances. In their kingdom, anyone found stealing from the royal household was banished out of the kingdom for being disloyal to the king. The chief guard knew this and staged the theft to teach Nneka a lesson by ensuring that she was banished from the village. The king, knowing what was coming, decided to put things right, as he could not stand the injustice that was meted out on Nneka by his own chief guard. The next night, the king, still trapped in his servant's body, approached his chief guard and offered him his favorite wine. The king, knowing his chief guard so well, knew that he could only get the truth out of him when he was drunk. After a few bottles, the chief guard's tongue went loose as he began to confess how he framed Nneka for stealing. The king ensured that the chief guard said all this in the presence of the chief palace overseer, who was senior to him in rank. By morning, the chief guard woke up and found himself locked up in the palace prison. He was so confused and asked the guard stationed in his cell why he was locked up. The guard narrated all that happened to him and how he confessed to setting Nneka up in front of the chief palace overseer, and the palace guard went on his knees and began to plead for mercy. After all investigations were carried out and the chief guard was found guilty. He was banished from the village for his treachery, and Nneka, who had suffered unjustly, was pardoned and celebrated for her integrity and resilience. As Nneka's life returned back to normal, she approached the king, who was still in the body of the palace servant. She thanked him for saving her life, and as they were talking, Nneka found herself falling deeply in love with him as she admired his wisdom and deep sense of justice. The king too fell in love with Nneka, but was confused on what to do as he was not in his original body and feared that Nneka would fall in love with his servant and not his true self. Nneka and the king soon began to spend time with each other, and their bond began to strengthen. One day, after careful deliberation, the king decided to tell Nneka the truth. He narrated his dream to Nneka and how he woke up in his servant's body. He told Nneka that he was the king, trapped in his servant's body, and Nneka laughed, thinking that it was a joke. The king then told Nneka that he was serious and did not know how he managed to switch bodies with his servant, and Nneka told him that it could be a curse and that the only way to break a curse is to trace the curse to its roots. Nneka told the king that he was a very terrifying king who was hated by most of the villagers because of how poorly he treated his subjects. She then told the king to think of the people that he had wronged in the past and that he should visit them one after the other to ask for their forgiveness. The king listened to Nneka and visited all the people he had wronged in the past to seek for their forgiveness. It was difficult because he was in his servant's body, but he ensured that he explained to them that the king was asking for their forgiveness, and the people were shocked and forgave him. On the last day, the king then remembered the poor widow who he forcefully collected her husband's land and destroyed all her crops. So he rushed to her hut in search of her. When he arrived at the poor widow's hut, he met her on her dying bed. The king apologized to her and pleaded for her forgiveness. The old woman recognized him and smiled, revealing that she placed the curse on him for him to live like a slave and understand the plight of his people. The king thanked the old woman as truly he now understood how badly he treated the people around him. The poor widow, on her sick bed, forgave the king and lifted the curse. But before she lifted the curse, she pleaded with the king to take good care of her grandson as he was blind and had no one to care for him. The king agreed, and to his amazement, he fell into a deep sleep and woke up in his own body in the palace. The king could not contain his joy as he vowed never to look down on any of his subjects again. His time as a servant taught him a great lesson, and the king made it his duty to serve his subjects, and he became compassionate to their needs. The king then rushed to visit the poor widow again, but by the time he arrived at her hut, she was already dead. This broke his heart as he ordered his guards to arrange a befitting burial for her. The king also invited the poor widow's grandson to live with him in the palace and apologized to him for what his guards had done to him. The king released the widow's land to her grandson and also made sure that he lived a very comfortable life in the palace. The king then went in search of Nneka and informed her that her suggestion worked. Nneka was shocked to see that the king was telling the truth all along. They began to spend more time together, and the king went on to ask Nneka to be his queen. Nneka agreed, and that was how the once proud and arrogant king served as a slave in his own palace, learning the importance of humility. The lesson to be learned from this story is that We should be humble in whatever position we find ourselves. Treat people kindly and be sensitive to their feelings. Do not use your authority to trample upon others, as you never know what life will throw at you in the nearest future. Be kind always. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps us grow our channel. I'll see you in our next story. Bye.